so we're looking at some of these opposing theories and things about, such as we've talked about that it was some kind of fraud or conspiracy, that the disciples stole the body, that someone else stole the body. We left off, and we'll pick up today with the idea that Jesus didn't actually die. And so all of these are to say, well, this is what actually happened. And the way that we're going about this is looking at this key information that we discussed, that everyone agrees on, that's virtually unanimous, basically, and to say, do these other theories explain that information at all? And so that is basically what we're doing. So we've showed how the idea that the disciples somehow stole the body and created a conspiracy, it just doesn't work. And then to say that, well, somebody else stole the body, that doesn't work either, and actually creates a lot more problems and more questions that we have to answer. And so what we left off with is this idea that it was a fraud, and specifically that Jesus didn't actually die. And so this was one that has been put forward probably since about the 600s, I would say, is about the earliest time that this was expressed. And so you can look at the bottom of page 3, and we'll talk about this a little bit, just as kind of reviewing, and then we'll pick up the last couple of questions on it. So there's this idea of, well, yeah, all of this stuff looked like it happened, right? But what if Jesus didn't actually die on the cross? And so there's been different variations to this. And we looked at, what all these old dead German guys have said. They're a lot of the ones who are writing about these things. But also the fact that one sort of angle on this is a possible interpretation from the Quran. And so we looked at that. That starts at the bottom of page 3. But basically the idea that it looked like Jesus died, but he didn't actually die. And as I said, there's a lot of question among Muslim interpreters as to what this passage actually means. So I don't want to convey to you that this is definitely, what it teaches. But one possible way to look at it is that Jesus was not actually crucified. And so regardless of what the particular idea of this theory is, it is the fact that people are arguing Jesus didn't actually die. And one of the well-known names for that is swoon theory. Can somebody remind us, what's this idea of swooning, and how does that connect to what we're talking about with Jesus? Maybe some of the younger people won't know what that swooning is, but...
It's not the idea that he just passed out and he didn't actually fully die.
Yeah. Have you ever had anybody swoon around you, Zach?
Not particularly, no.
No. But yeah, that's the idea of fainting or something. We don't really use it that often. But yeah, this idea that Jesus swooned, lost consciousness, and then at some point, this particular way of stating the theory says, he regained consciousness inside the tomb, got himself out of the tomb, and then started presenting himself to the disciples as alive. So we looked at all these questions, the first half of page 4, kind of looking at the core of this claim. And Sean, it just doesn't really fit with information. So, one thing is, what did we say about Jesus' death by crucifixion? How sure is that when we look at ancient history?
Pretty sure.
That's about as sure as we can get with ancient history, right? One of the surest facts of the ancient world is that Jesus of Nazareth died by crucifixion. And so starting to question all of those things, right, then that's a snowball. That we wouldn't know anything about the ancient world if we're saying that didn't happen. And so all of these are denying really the key facts, some bedrock things that are, the only word that's coming to mind is sure as we can get about what happened in the ancient world. And also, I think what's really kind of the core of this, we talked about, could seeing a crucified but not totally dead Jesus have convinced the disciples that he was who he said he was. Again, put yourself in their shoes. And if you saw this guy who got close enough to being dead that everyone thought he was dead, and then he miraculously somehow regains consciousness and is able to literally crawl out of that hole in the ground in those tombs that we saw and then present himself to the disciples, is it at all probable that they walk away from that interaction thinking, yes, this is God's risen Messiah?
Well, if they believed he was dead, then the second fact would have been the same. But if they thought he was faking it,
Yeah.
then, so again, it's your question, if they believed it, then I think their opinion would be the same. But if they were in on this or assumed that he wasn't dead, then it would be all based on this big conspiracy.
So yeah, if they saw that he wasn't dead, then it would have changed all that. Brace.
I mean, that he went through all the things that the scriptures describe about regarding scourging and crucifixion, most of which I think, again, secondary sources will substantiate. Even if he regains consciousness, is able to somehow get out of the tomb, he's going to be extremely weak.
Yeah,
Look like a man who's half dead.
because he is.
Not a man who raised from the dead. So, I don't think they would be convinced by that. They might be glad he's alive, but they're not going to think, wow, this is absolutely amazing. He was dead and now he's alive again, and propagate that story everywhere.
Yeah. Salem and I were talking about this, and I don't know why this has stuck with us, but probably 15 years ago, right? We saw this sermon video of a guy, and he was talking about this sort of idea, and specifically the road to Emmaus. And he's saying that, if we are saying Jesus didn't actually die, but somehow, he goes 7 miles to Emmaus and then is catching up with those disciples, and he's having all these interactions with people and presenting himself as alive. The guy was like, I can't even stub my toe without feeling like my pelvis is going to explode out of my body. And to say that this mostly dead Jesus runs 7 miles to Emmaus and then is presenting himself to all these people, and they say, oh yeah, this guy is back from the dead, just does not make a lot of sense. And further, does that kind of picture of this guy trying to lie and persuade everyone that he has in fact been resurrected, does that fit with what we know from Jesus about Scripture or even just ancient history? Is that the Jesus that we know? No. And that's even what, Josephus or all these other people would say. They present him as a very good moral teacher that had a huge influence on a lot of different people. And to say that he was then some kind of charlatan just doesn't fit with what we know. So I want to share a quote that we went over last time that, again, I think summarizes a lot of this. And so just to remind you, this is one of those old dead German guys. And this is seen as being kind of the final nail in the coffin for this sort of idea. And it's been a long time since anyone has tried to say, well, Jesus didn't actually die. And a lot of it is because of what this guy said. So, this man says, it is impossible that a being, Jesus, who had stolen half dead out of the sepulchre tomb, who crept about weak and ill, wanting medical treatment, who required bandaging, strengthening, and indulgence, and who still at least yielded to his sufferings, meaning he later would die, that he could have given to his disciples the impression that he was a conqueror over death and the grave, the Prince of Life, an impression which lay at the bottom of their future ministry. Such a resuscitation could only have weakened the impression which he had made upon them in life and in death, and at the most could only have given it I tripped over this last time, elegiac, however you say that voice, but could by no possibility have changed their sorrow into enthusiasm, have elevated their reverence into worship. So he's saying, if this Jesus, like we're saying, that didn't actually die, but was as close to it as possible, presents himself to the disciples, a spear hole in his side, and his blood coming out of his hands, and beaten and scourged, and all of these things. How could they possibly walk away from that interaction with anything except for a complete removal of all their confidence in him? Right? Because if they saw this, it would undermine everything that he had said about who he was, undermine all of their confidence in it, and then somehow they're taking that interaction and using that as the basis for their suffering and their martyrdoms for the rest of their life. It just does not explain the information. It doesn't say how they could, again, walk away saying, this man is the conqueror over death. This is the Prince of Life. This is the one that we need to worship. And so I think that summarizes it pretty well. Do we have any questions so far before we tackle real quick the last two questions on this theory? I know we're kind of jumping back in. Emily?
Another thing is it says that they didn't understand when he said that he was going to raise 3 days. So seeing someone who's passed out and is on the brink of death and looks that bad, I don't think I would then go, oh yeah, I'm going to go tell everyone he raised from the dead. I think I'm going to go tell everyone he escaped death and he's still alive and he never died. Why would they then, if they didn't understand that he was going to be raised from the dead, why would they go around saying, oh yeah, he was raised from the dead, not just he didn't die?
Those are the questions that need answers, right? If we're going to say all this. Those are the good questions. So even more so from the disciples, we're looking at number 4 on page 4 here. Would an apparent death of Jesus, Jesus getting super close to death, appearing dead but not actually dying, could that in any way explain Paul's belief in the resurrection? No. Okay, why do we say no? That's the right answer, but Andrew.
Paul would already be predisposed to thinking that this new way is false. And so if it is based on falsehood, there's nothing that Paul would have been a witness to that could have convinced him. Because from his position as a skeptic, he would have seen either it being a falsehood, it being a hoax, or not seen it at all, and so not been convinced by it. You would have to say that Paul's conversion, if this is a true scenario that Jesus didn't die, Paul's conversion would have to be either an independent hallucination on his own or some sort of crisis of conscience because of his persecuting of Christians that he just breaks down and flips.
Yeah, so we got to, it adds more questions, right? We have to put together all of these theories to explain these things. To say, because Paul did think this was a conspiracy before he was converted. I would imagine if we just look at the evidence, the most likely explanation to him was that the disciples did steal the body. I'm sure that's what he thought. So this idea of Jesus being, half alive, whatever it was, Paul thought it was a conspiracy. What does he say was what actually convinced him that Jesus had been risen from the dead? Out of his own mouth.
That he actually appeared to him and that he was to make him an eyewitness.
He said, I saw him with my own eyes. I saw the risen Jesus, and he didn't see a half-dead Jesus. He saw the Prince of Life that was, in the glory of God. And he says that is what convinced him. And then after that, he goes and talks to all these people that said that they saw him alive again too. And so think about that. He is later investigating all this, their experiences and what they had been saying through their eyewitness testimony. And so he's getting to the bottom of all of this too. It doesn't explain at all how Paul, the persecutor, could come to be the foremost proponent of the gospel then, if Jesus was just apparently dead. And lastly, when we're looking at this, all of these, whether it is the disciples stole the body, that somebody else stole the body, that Jesus didn't actually die, all of these conspiracies, we can say that stuff all we want, but we have to have some kind of evidence or reason to back up the claim that we're making. You can't just say, oh, it was a conspiracy, and then not show why it was a conspiracy, right? So is there any evidence of fraud somewhere? Is there anything that would point us in the direction of that this was some kind of fraud or conspiracy? Not really. There's not anything. And again, to remind us, nowhere do we have any record of any of the original people coming and saying, yeah, we made it all up. Nobody, as they're being beaten to death, then turns back and says it was all false. We didn't actually see him. Nobody goes back on it. They're all resolute to death, and we know with conspiracies that does not happen, that everyone stays the course and keeps the same story. There are all of these just incidental things, as we said, that coalesce into showing that we're being given just the straightforward story. It's not an embellishment, it's very straightforward, matter of fact, and all of these things come together and show that there's this reliable story that we're being given. There's just not any fraud anywhere. And to claim that it's some kind of conspiracy then, if someone's going to claim that, you're going to say, okay, show me. You know, where is this? Because I'm not seeing it. Because we can make claims all day, but we have to back those claims up. Okay. We could talk about so much more with all of these, but does anybody have any more questions about this idea of conspiracy, or maybe in particular this idea of a swoon theory? Yes, Samantha.
Something that's been on my mind since you brought it up, but like I would think if Jesus had not actually died, wouldn't it be true that the soldiers who had crucified him would have been put to death then because they had to do their job and do it right?
Yeah, I mean, usually that was the same kind of idea as if a prisoner escapes under your watch, you're dead. You know, if you fail at whatever your duty was, you're dead. All of those kind of things. And that's part of why, you know, with the temple guard that was at the tomb, the Sanhedrin says, we'll cover for you, because if the Romans found out that something happened under their watch, the penalty was death. Right? So there's all of these kind of things. Yeah, if this came out, if that's what actually happened, then there would have been a lot more deaths than just Jesus. We can put it that way. That's how it rolled back in those days. Okay. So if nothing else, then we'll move on to this next kind of core idea here that's been presented of that this was all just some kind of hallucination, right? So the disciples hallucinated at the bottom of page 4 is the next thing we'll look at. There's a lot of variations that have popped up. So it could be that one person hallucinated Jesus being alive and then convinced the rest of them. It could be that there was a whole group of them that had some kind of hallucination. Or it's been said maybe it was just some kind of grief-induced delusion where they didn't actually see something, but they just have this false belief because of their mental state. Or some kind of spiritual vision. I mean, there's a lot of variations, so we're just going to be kind of looking at it generally. But it's this objection that the disciples were sincere in their belief, yes. But what they actually saw was just a hallucination of Jesus being alive because of their extreme grief after seeing him executed. So like we said, sometimes it's said that Peter, you know, being the ringleader, maybe Peter had a hallucination, then he's able to convince everyone else of, I saw Jesus alive, and then they start to think, oh yeah, I saw Jesus alive too, and it's just this chain reaction. Or it could be that they were all in some situation together where they had this collective hallucinatory experience. And I know that this probably sounds strange to a lot of us, but again, people are trying to come up with other explanations for the evidence. And so nobody is questioning their sincerity with this. They're just saying, what is it actually that they saw? Was it really Jesus, or was it just some kind of hallucination? And so as we saw in the introduction of this packet, usually, you know, academics and things today will say, yeah, they saw something, but we just don't know what it is that they saw. And usually one of the ideas will be, yeah, they saw some kind of hallucination, or they wanted to see something so badly that then their brains just kind of cooked it up. and they saw what they wanted to. So looking at this, and we'll start looking at these questions on page number 5 of the disciples hallucinated. Before that, do we have any questions about what this theory is claiming, or maybe any of the particulars? Because I understand it might not make sense to all of us at first. We're painting with a broad brush, of course, so. Okay, all on the same page.
Pretty far-fetched.
I would agree with you.
You really gotta wanna not believe this to come up with.
Yeah. Usually, yeah.
I mean, you could almost say the stolen and it was a conspiracy, but I mean, this one, you really wanna look at it and go, really?
Yeah, I'm trying to be a little nice. I'll let you not be nice, but it is, there's a lot you have to prove with this. So number 1 on page 5, we're kind of just looking at this high level at first, and then get into comparing it with some of the facts. So number 1, considering the nature of hallucinations, just thinking about what we usually understand with those kind of things, is it at all likely that for one, maybe more than a dozen people, so the original 12 disciples, that more than a dozen people, or maybe even 500, because remember one of the key appearances was to the more than 500 brothers and sisters, some of whom are still alive. So either more than a dozen people have to have a hallucination, or more than 500 people have to have a hallucination. Is it likely that they would all experience the same thing repeatedly? Because remember, there's different situations and different times over this month period or so, 40 days or so, where people are saying, I saw Jesus alive, and I saw him here. I saw him over here. We all saw him here. Would they have all experienced the same thing repeatedly? Andrew, do you have your hand up?
Yeah, I was just going to say that if we're defining hallucination as seeing something that truly isn't there, it's a concoction of our own mind, our own subconscious, then I can see almost no chance that many people over such a stretched out period of time continuously be hallucinating the same thing. If it's from everybody's own mind, even if two people are hallucinating simultaneously, if there's nothing to go off of, then there's almost no chance that their subconscious would be creating the same images and that they would describe the same events. It almost kind of would force someone to say that it's some sort of illusion rather than hallucination, that there's some stimulus that they're seeing and that they're all misinterpreting it somehow.
Yeah. Yeah, and we'll get back to that in a second. There's this nature of everyone experiencing the same thing. Brace?
In fairness, I could possibly see where, because of the cohesion of the group of apostles, especially what would have likely occurred after the crucifixion, they've got nobody else to turn to except each other. I could see one of them being so convinced they saw Jesus that they somehow convinced the rest of them that he was seeing a vision. And they wanted to be in on the vision because they wanted to be as close as he was to Jesus. I could see perhaps them being convinced because of their cohesion that, let's say, Peter or John or James or whoever had a vision of Jesus being in the room, and so then every time he appeared, they essentially said, well, is he with us today? Is he with us right now? And so then reporting what was reported to them in their own words, in their own accounts. I could see that.
Yeah.
But that's not all we've got to explain.
Right.
So they really didn't all have a hallucination. Peter did, or James did, or somebody did, and convinced the rest of them that he was seeing Jesus, and so he's alive, and therefore we're going to report that to everybody that Jesus is back.
Yeah, so I want to talk about that for a second. So this idea that, maybe it's one or just a couple of them are having this sort of secret it would be like a spiritual experience, right? We see that like some kind of vision of, well, Jesus is here with us. Like we sing, he is in our midst, right? He's here kind of spiritually. Would that communicate to them that he had been bodily raised from the grave? No, because some kind of like apparition or spiritual vision would mean what? He was dead. Yeah, he's dead, right? It would mean that he's dead.
The fact is that they believe he physically was alive. So it was a hallucination. And there could be some power in the Christian faith if Jesus they saw him as a vision like we see in the Old Testament. You know,
Yeah.
we see that the people had visions of angels and people came to them. But that's not, and if that was the case, I think that's what they would say. I saw a vision and Jesus is beside the Father.
He's alive spiritually.
Yeah,
And
but
then they
that's-
wouldn't have to go and prove all of this stuff
Right.
that they were
But
proving.
that's not, but the hallucination, he is physically alive. And to everybody, it would be, like Andrew said, impossible
Yeah.
to get that many people to see something even remotely similar.
Yeah. And so some kind of spiritual experience or vision like that would mean Jesus was dead. It would not mean that he was physically alive, right? And they understood that. We see that throughout, the Old Testament, New Testament, that they understood if you're seeing a vision like that of somebody that they're maybe spiritually alive, but physically they're dead. And so that wouldn't really explain the information. Andrew.
If I was trying to disprove the supernatural event of the crucifixion and resurrection, I wouldn't lean on the supernatural occurrence of a vision.
Yeah.
To say that a supernatural vision explains away a supernatural resurrection doesn't accomplish my goal of trying to deny the supernatural.
Yeah, there's so many variations to all of this, and it's kind of hard to peg all of it down. But yeah, we're showing just kind of in general how all this works. This does not follow with that. It doesn't explain the information we have. So if you were to look at just kind of the nature of hallucinations and things, I was really hoping Harriet would be here today. It helps to have a 30-year psych nurse here to kind of be like, yeah, this is, how people go through that. But if you look at just kind of the understanding of hallucinations and things, there are a few pretty sure points that come through that now I'm reading off of what some experts have said. So one, hallucinations are rarely, if ever, experienced numerous times by both individuals and groups over an extended amount of time. You don't have the same people seeing the same exact thing over a prolonged period of time. And that's what they're saying with Jesus. There's not this wide, broad thing. They're saying, no, we saw him physically alive and we talked with him. It's not, oh, I saw him riding in the sky over here and I saw him, glowing over here or whatever it is. It's, no, we saw him in the same exact way and we talked with him and we ate with him and we touched him. It's all the same. But we have however many dozens of people over a relatively long period of time saying the same exact thing, and that's not the way that hallucinations operate. So, and then again, kind of off of that, hallucinations or something like that are not usually seen by large groups. A big group of people don't all say the same thing. When something real happens, a big group of people don't all see the same thing. Bystanders and witnesses to car accidents and things, we understand that. But to say that they're all hallucinating the same thing, as Jesus being seen by the 12 or more than 500, that's not how that works, right? And then in particular, they say hallucinations have never led to the claim that a dead person had been resurrected. There's no other case of that. To say, oh yeah, this hallucination led people to believe that this person who was actually dead was physically alive, right? You might have a relative that is so struck by grief at the death of a family member and they say, well, I saw them with me in the room or I experienced them or something. But if they started saying, no, they're right here and I can touch them, you'd probably take them to the hospital, right? This is not what usually happens. And then in this same vein with hallucinations like this do not involve someone like Paul who's an enemy. So we could explain, yeah, that the disciples, maybe they're in this kind of sympathetic frame of mind where they want to see Jesus alive, and that would make a little bit more sense. But to say that Paul, who is a sworn enemy and literally saying, I'm trying to wipe them all off the face of the planet, that he somehow has a hallucination of Jesus to where he becomes sympathetic and then wants to follow him. That's not how that works either. And part of this is because this is getting a little theoretical here. Where do hallucinations come from? What's their raw material that they work off? It's things in your brain. Hallucinations or, drug trips or whatever it is, they work off of what's already in their brain. They can't create anything new, right? And that opens up a whole other can of worms. How are they then taking their experiences and their understanding of things and coming up with something completely new and unprecedented in the history of the world? That this man had been crucified and then risen by God from the dead. And we don't have the time to get into all that, but I wanted to at least make sure to mention it. The raw material for hallucination is what's in our brains already. So we could say that they hallucinated something about Jesus on the cross because they saw that. But it's a huge step to say that then they saw him alive and experienced him in all of these ways. Again, that's a little abstract and theoretical, but I wanted to at least present it. So looking at number 2, could an individual hallucination or a hallucination by even just a small group of them, could that have convinced the over 500 other people that end up claiming that they saw the risen Jesus? No. Yeah. A small group of people hallucinating, how is that going to convince several hundred other people that they saw him too? That is another question that would need an answer, because that's not really what would happen.
The only thing would be is if it was such a popular movement that they made themselves, they changed their beliefs to say, yeah, me too, because they want to be part of it. But
yeah,
like we talked about in the facts, the movement wasn't glorious, glamorous, and popular.
Yeah, I want to be part of that too, and so I'm going to agree with you and suffer and be killed for it. That's not what happens.
And he supposedly appeared to more than 500, or at least they believed in this vision of the resurrected Jesus. But on the day of Pentecost, there's only 120 of them together. So,
Right.
I mean, did they believe or did they not believe? And so it's like,
Yeah. So number 3, what did the disciples communicate that they saw? Were they communicating, we saw some kind of spiritual vision or something like that? Because they were aware of those things, right? What did they communicate that they saw?
That they saw the living Jesus who talked to them, ate with them, showed them his wounds.
Right, so there was this physical experience through sense perception, right? We talked about that. Or in 1 John, the eyewitnesses, what we have seen with our eyes and heard with our ears and touched with our hands. This was not in our minds. We experienced this through our senses.
I mean, they said he was dead, and now he is alive.
Right. Were they aware of things like ghosts and visions and all that? They did think he was a ghost at first, right? So let's turn to Luke chapter 24. So this is just to show that they were aware of those kinds of things, and they had that kind of skeptical mindset at first. They're not just all wholesale falling into this idea. But verses, can somebody read Luke 24, 36 through 43? Luke 24, 36 through 43. Josh, you got that?
36 to 43?
Yep.
When they were telling these things, he himself stood in their midst and said to them, Peace be with you. But they were startled and frightened and thought they were seeing a spirit. He said to them,
why are you troubled? And why do your doubts arise in your hearts? See my hands and my feet, that it is I myself? Touch me and see, for a spirit does not have flesh and bones as you see that I have. When he said this, he showed them his hands and his feet. Well, they could not believe it because of their joy and amazement. He said to them, have you anything here to eat? They gave him a piece of broiled fish, and he took it and ate it before them.
Okay, thank you. So, this is embarrassing, right? The core group of disciples, Jesus appears to them, and they think, oh man, it's a ghost. And so we talk about this kind of principle of embarrassment, where if you're going to make up a story, you're not going to claim that your core group of leaders have no idea what's going on, that they think that Jesus is a ghost. They said, that is what we thought, but then we were proven wrong. It wasn't a ghost, and we know that because he said, touch me and sit down and eat with me and all of these kinds of things. They said, we understand this idea about ghosts and visions. That is not what we experienced. And we're willing to take that to the grave. Right? Again, if it was some kind of like just a vision, why would you die for that? And like lie and make up all of these things. So they were aware of what it could be, and that is not what they communicated. They said, we saw him alive, we touched him, we ate with him, we talked to him.
They even mistook Jesus for a ghost when he was still alive.
Yeah, walking on the water. They thought he was a ghost then.
Clearly, they were quick to jump to ghosts.
Yeah.
And so they needed to be convinced that that's not what they were seeing.
And that's part of the difference between us and them too, right? They were more open to supernatural things in their worldview than we are today. And so they understood, oh, maybe we're seeing a ghost or some kind of spirit or something, and we just think that is total hokum, right? That's dumb. Why would they think that? But they are understanding, oh, it could be all of this, and then they're saying, no, that's not what it is, right? Yeah, there were multiple times where they thought that Jesus was a ghost. And it's kind of funny when you think about it, but that is not what was happening. Number 4, we kind of already talked about that a little bit out of turn. So if the disciples did hallucinate, would Jesus being risen from the dead be the only or even the most likely conclusion that they would draw? And so I know that question is worded a little difficultly, but the idea is, where would they get this idea of Jesus being physically risen from the dead if this was some kind of hallucination? Because it would have to arise from their experiences, what was in their brains already. And so again, you could say that they had some kind of vision of Jesus being on the cross, and then God takes him to heaven or something like that, right? Because they're witnessing that raw material is in their brains that it could work off of. But there's just not any explanation with how they would have been able to come up with this completely unparalleled, marvelous idea of Jesus being risen from the dead. So we talked about that a little bit, but does anyone want to add anything to it? Andrew?
Why couldn't you argue that they did hear Jesus say that he would be resurrected? They were at least in his presence when he said that. So if we're making the claim that hallucinations rely on the raw material of what's already in your head, they had at least heard that. I could see someone trying to claim that, oh, maybe now is when they reinterpreted what they remembered him saying.
Yeah.
Played into what they thought they saw.
Yeah, and that could be possible, but when we start to look at the larger picture of what they claimed, again, this individual resurrection of God's crucified Messiah, that he would be cursed by God, and that actually meant that everything that God had promised had been true, and this was the fulfillment of the law, and this shows the hope of our resurrection and all of these things. That was nowhere in anyone's brain. So we could say, yeah, that they reinterpreted and they said, well, Jesus is actually alive from the dead because we heard him say that. But then we have to come up with an explanation for how did they figure out all the rest of this stuff. Because even after Jesus was raised, they didn't understand all of that. He had to expound it for them. And so, yeah, that gets us part of the way, but it doesn't explain all of it. Right? Does a hallucination explain the empty tomb?
It could. I mean, if they're gonna hallucinate that he's alive, why not hallucinate that he's gone?
Okay, so hallucinate that the tomb is empty, but it's not actually empty. Then what happens?
I mean, it falls apart
Yeah.
in details, but, I mean, if you're gonna go that far-fetched, I mean, you could just far-fetch the other one too.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah, they could-
if you saw, a herd of unicorns, you might as well put flying elephants with them.
I have no question as to your opinion of this stuff. Yeah, so they could imagine that the tomb was empty, but that doesn't mean that the body disappears, right? Because they could say, yeah, the tomb is empty, and then the leaders in Jerusalem say, you guys are off your rocker. He's right here. And then that's the end of that. But as we saw with that fact, everyone, including his enemies, agreed Jesus' body was gone. So we could even say, yeah, the disciples hallucinated that he was alive. That doesn't explain why the body was still gone. And the resurrection could still be true. Right? Even if they did originally hallucinate, that doesn't explain the rest of the facts that show that the resurrection is the most likely explanation. So it just doesn't explain all the rest of it. And then number 6, as we talked about, does a grief-induced hallucination of the disciples, or even Paul himself, explain the belief in transformation of Paul of Tarsus? No. So we talked about that a little bit in looking at fact number 4 with Paul. What kind of mental state was he in? Was he in one to where he would feel sympathetic to Jesus or sorry for what he was doing to the disciples?
Persecutor of the Christians.
Yeah, he was persecuting them. Why was he persecuting them? He thought they were blaspheming God and that the law required him to kill them all.
He had zero remorse.
Right.
There was no guilt. He was doing what the law commanded.
He was doing God's will.
Yes.
He said, I thought it was my responsibility to do everything possible in my power to get rid of Jesus of Nazareth. Grief-induced hallucination does not explain Paul's belief because he was absolutely seared in his conscience that what he was doing was what God wanted him to do. So that doesn't explain his belief in what he says. Could we say that somehow hallucinations from the disciples influenced him in his belief? That's really even more far-fetched. I think that would maybe incite him even more as they're claiming, oh, well, he's alive in this way, and I could just see it taking Paul over the edge. That's the last straw, right? It does not in any way explain how Paul comes to this belief, to say that there was some kind of hallucination. And we'd have more and more and more and more and more things that we have to explain. And it's just not a very good explanation. You can go ahead, Stan. Okay, so on Wednesday, we'll pick up with this idea of, well, this is all just a legend. Maybe it's some kind of myth. Maybe the disciples embellished it all. We'll look at that broad category. Do we have any questions or comments before we end? Yeah, Chip.
I can see why this conclusion is the most prevalent, most neutral, because on one hand you're saying that the resurrection isn't true, but you're also giving respect to the disciples and saying that these were actually good intentions on their part.
Yeah, they're still sincere. Yeah, I think it's a really easy jump to make, I think it's easy. Some people, I'm not saying I'm saying this, some people have said it's really lazy to just say, well, it was just all some kind of hallucination. I assume Aaron would say that. But yeah, you can see how somebody who doesn't want to believe in the explanation of the resurrection would say something like this. Okay, so we will pick up on Wednesday at the bottom of page 5, starting that section of It's Just a Legend.